Welcome, everyone, to The Dirty Hands of the Republic. It's a podcast of two former police officers who want to take the time to sit down and explain to the public what issues confront police officers and how law enforcement, basically your patrol officers, the guys on the street, the ones you see in the uniform in the patrol cars, the ones that you never really hear from or listen to on shows like Court TV or in dramas like Law and Order, or you see them on Cops, but you don't really understand what goes behind the decisions they're making while you're watching that show. It's all very soundbite-ish, short clips. And so what we're hoping to do is expound on what goes on through an officer's mind when you're dealing with a police officer on the street, and how the policies and the procedures and the laws that are created to regulate those officers will affect those officers' decisions. And it's something that a lot of people don't really understand. And every time I give a speech or every time I start talking to people in the public about departmental policy and the procedures that go behind the rules manual of each department, it does more to affect the officer's conduct than anything else. What really kind of creates the institution of liberty is at home, and it starts at home with police officers and the way that they deal with the public. And as long as officers are cognizant of individual liberty as it's found in the Bill of Rights, from the First Amendment through the Eighth Amendment, including the Second Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, which are very important for officers, I think, to keep in mind. And through the course of these podcasts, we'll tell different stories that we experienced as police officers that reinforced the points, the necessity to keep in mind how important it is that each citizen and even immigrants have individual liberty that has to be respected by police officers. And that's really where freedom is captured, because, you know, as many soldiers can die overseas as would happen in any war, won't defend freedom if the law enforcement community at home doesn't respect it and doesn't go through the effort to protect it at home when they're dealing with individual citizens. And so through the course of these podcasts, you have to understand that, you know, there is a rough job to do for police officers. And it's not simply a job that requires force or violence, but it also requires thought, and it requires a certain level of intelligence to interact with the public in a way that is positive and reinforcing of individual liberty, which is what separates our country from every other country on the earth, is that our officers take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. We don't take an oath to an administration. We don't take an oath to, you know, some organization or anything like that. We take an oath to protect and defend an idea, and that idea is captured really in the Constitution, but more importantly, in the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. And so that's what we're hoping to elucidate for people over time.
My name is Joseph Fenwick. I'm about a 30-year police officer, 29-year police officer. I was in the Army as an infantryman, and then became a police officer in several different states. And so what Tom is saying, that police officers, we have a rough job to do. In 1984, the book 1984, George Orwell wrote, "Citizens sleep securely in their beds at night because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf," and which is very true. The dirty hands of the Republic means the officers, the soldiers who get out there and get their hands dirty to protect the public, to protect the Republic, to protect their home and country. Tom and I both have a profound respect for the Constitution, for individual rights, and we hate to see the direction that police work is going. The scrutiny that police officers get these days that is not reasonable, it is unreasonable, and does not allow officers to do their job, and it hampers them from doing their job, because officers are now afraid to do their job because they're going to lose their job.
Well, it's the accusation without foundation.
Certainly.
People love hurling accusations at police officers and saying, you must be racist, or you must be homophobic, or you must be trans, without any basis upon which to make that accusation.
Exactly.
I mean, I've even seen Black police officers, Hispanic police officers, and Asian police officers accused of racism. And it's like, the meaning of the term is lost in those kinds of interactions with the public.
Yes.
And then people try to convince themselves of something that is untrue. But once they're married to the untruth, they're unwilling to give it up. And that's what makes it so destructive.
Yeah. The word, let's say, racism has been devalued so much that it doesn't even mean anything anymore. And if I hear somebody say racist, okay, what I do is I look back at the finger that's pointing and see who's saying it.
Who's it connected to?
Yeah, who's it connected to, and what's the reason for it?
So one of the stories I'd tell about this very thing, for example, is I worked in one district, City of Houston, 1 Adam 20's beat. What is that? That's the Montrose area, Montrose and Westheimer area. It's what was otherwise known as the gay part of town, right? Because there's a lot of gay bars in that part of town. And I worked there for about 5 years. And one of my supervisors was a guy named Cullen Bean. So everybody just called him Judd Bean, but I called him Sergeant Bean because that's who he is. And we were at a disturbance involving lesbians and people of color, and coming out of a club. And of course, I was a younger, aggressive officer, and this one Black female lesbian had a pistol that I saw partially on the floorboard sticking out from underneath the driver's seat of the vehicle. And so I reached down and I grabbed it because Sergeant Bean had gotten her out of the vehicle. And when he did, I had my flashlight looking through the windshield to try to see if she had a weapon, because I was, always on the lookout for a weapon. And I see a pistol.
Safety.
Yeah, I see a pistol on the floorboard. So as soon as I could, I went around the door, reached in, grabbed the handgun, and unloaded it and secured it. And I know Sergeant Bean was also looking. Every officer on that scene was looking for weapons because it was a disturbance. And by nature, you start looking for weapons on the scene of a disturbance. And he's talking to who we believed at the time was the person causing the disturbance. And it turned out, of course, she wasn't. But needless to say, she was just really just an innocent kind of witness to what was going on. She just happened to be friends of somebody who was involved in a fight. And so, of course, I'm thinking, well, I'm going to arrest her for illegally possessing this weapon. This was back in probably 2002 or 2003, before the Texas Penal Code was changed to allow people to carry weapons unlicensed. So this is, almost 20 years ago. And I go up to Sergeant Bean and I'm like, well, I found this weapon underneath the driver's side seat. You want me to go ahead and arrest her for it? And he looks at me and goes, have you ever heard of the Second Amendment? And I just looked at it and I felt so stupid because I was in law school at the time. Uh-huh. Like I was in my second year of law school. So of course, I'd read the Constitution 10 times. I'd read the Bill of Rights 20 times. And he just looked at me and he's like, and he's just staring at me, and I'm like, yeah. And I'm just, yeah, Sarge. Well, don't you think the Second Amendment applies to her too? And I'm like, yeah, of course. And he's like, oh yeah, of course it does. And it didn't matter what her sexual orientation was. It didn't matter what her skin color was. It didn't matter what her sex was.
It was a weapon.
The only thing that mattered,
that's right.
It was that she had a weapon. But what mattered to Sergeant Bean was the fact that she's a citizen who's entitled to carry a weapon for her own defense. And the Second Amendment equally applies to her as it would anyone else. And I was like, well, what do you want me to do? And he goes, well, when we clear the scene, just hand it back to her unloaded, and then give her the bullets, and we'll leave. And I was like, okay. And so that's what I did. And so at the time I was kind of embarrassed, but because of course, I was a big supporter of the Second Amendment, but it's not until the rubber meets the road where a police officer is actually interacting with a citizen that the Bill of Rights really matters. And you need to have supervisors like Sergeant Bean who remind their officers the importance of individual liberty and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and makes sure that their officers are respecting the individual liberties of each person. Now, of course, stories like that don't make the news. you're never going to go home and turn on NBC or CBS or ABC and there's breaking news, HPD Sergeant Cullen Bean defends the Second Amendment and defends the constitutional rights of a minority person of color, on the streets of Houston. That'll never be breaking news. And so what people don't realize is that you never see those stories. You never hear those stories. The only ones you ever see are the bad ones. And so I learned a lot just from that very tiny disturbance scene. I was reminded of so much about what I had been taught as both a law student and a police officer about the importance of defending individual liberty and protecting and defending the Constitution. And I was actually, now looking back on it, very thankful that I had a supervisor in Sergeant Bean who that was always at the forefront of his police decision was, let's not violate anyone's individual rights, but let's enforce the law. So let's make sure we have probable cause, and let's make sure our probable cause does not violate anyone's constitutional rights. And so that's kind of that balance that each officer has to maintain as they go through and enforce the law. Mm-hmm. And it's a difficult thing to do. And of course, there needs to be checks and balances, but that's why you have to have supervisors, good supervisors, because bad supervisors, I think, always lead to bad results because then they're not there, making sure that their officers are doing exactly what they need to be doing. And then you wind up with bad acts.
I know you're about to switch off this video thinking that we're bleeding heart liberals. That's not what we're saying. We're not. If I was watching this video, I might go, oh, what are these? They don't know anything. I'm out here to enforce law. Well, okay, so are we. We.
There are no doubt. There are times when you have to open up a can of whoop ass and you got to make somebody eat the can, because there are times when someone's individual liberties are thrown out the window simply because they have made the decision to escalate a fight. They've decided to pull a gun.
Yes.
As an act of aggression, they've decided to pull a knife. They've decided to get into a fight, and they want a fight. I mean, believe it or not, there are suspects out there. There are people out there who want to fight the police.
Yes. Yeah. It's becoming more and more prevalent as police officers are being scrutinized more and demonized more for taking any kind of action. The people are now wanting to fight, wanting to argue, wanting to scream, wanting to holler at you, get in your face, and do things simply because of what's trendy right now.
And those people you got to make when they decide to fight. For example, when you're dealing with Antifa, it would be a perfect example. Are people who are looking for a fight.
Yes.
Okay. Well, if you're looking for a fight, sometimes you just have to sit back and say, okay, is this person wanting a physical, violent confrontation? Because burning down people's businesses, burning down courthouses, burning down police precincts is not a productive endeavor. That is not a constitutionally protected right. That is not something that the First Amendment would say, that's a good thing, keep doing that.
Yeah, that is not.
Because that doesn't, all that does is create extreme amounts of animosity. And that's what really, when you absorb the Constitution and all of it, it really tries to absolve people of their anger by providing them with freedom. And because people really want to be free. That's what they want. They want to be free and independent. That's, what John F. Kennedy said all people should desire to be is free and independent. And police officers are really supposed to protect that. But when you start committing crimes, when you start violating the penal code, when you start committing crimes against the peace and dignity of the state of Texas or any other state, and you start committing crimes against individual citizens or immigrants, whoever that is that you're, because now you're violating their civil rights. Now you're violating their right to be left alone, their right to live a peaceful existence. That's when the police are supposed to step in and stop you. And if that requires violence, well, then it requires violence. Mm-hmm. And so through this process and through these podcasts, what we're hoping to do is explain to people what that process is, and in a way that enlightens people to the fact that police officers are human beings. They react like human beings. They think like human beings, and they make mistakes like human beings. And so the severity of the mistake or the severity of the event is what's going to ultimately dictate the department's reaction. But sometimes departments can be irrational because departments are run by human beings. and they make mistakes, and they can be irrational in their response. And so that's kind of what we're trying to make sense of. And we're hoping through the course of time to help, the audience make sense of it.